Some men never speak, some trees never forget, and some stories only unfold when the wind decides to whisper. This is the tale of an old cowboy who sleeps beneath the same tree every day, until one morning 7 silent children appear with wooden toys that time forgot, bringing with them a memory too deep to name. If you're listening to this tale in the quiet of your own night, let us know what time it is where you are and where you're watching from. Because sometimes the hour tells more than the words. Leave a soft comment below like a footprint in the dust. Tap that like button if the silence feels familiar, and subscribe to follow more of these slow, shadowed journeys into forgotten places, where the West isn't wild but weary, and every echo is a reminder that some children only come back to remind us who we used to be. An old cowboy lies sleeping beneath the same wide-branched tree every day. The sun's warmth has long since bleached his weathered hat, and the dusty roots cradle him like an old friend. He hasn't said a word to passers-by, nor expected any greetings, yet everyone in this ghost town valley seems to respect the quiet ritual of his presence there. A vigil without purpose, a man simply being tethered to that barren soil. Each morning he stirs as if from a half-forgotten dream, brushing dust from his coat, its leather cracked, its color faded, and adjusts the battered ridge of his pants before standing and stretching into the pale dawn light. Wordless, he leans his rifle against the tree, tucks his hands into worn gloves, and gazes out across the empty plains, listening to the distant rumble of tumbleweeds and the occasional creak of old fence posts swaying in the breeze. No children laugh, no horses whinny, no bells chime. Only the soft sigh of hot wind and the faint rustle of dry grass. He remains motionless for minutes or hours, it's hard to tell, and in that stillness, one might swear the land breathes alongside him. It is as if nature itself recognizes his grief, his unspoken, unfinished business, and holds its breath in solidarity. He never carries water or claims a shelter. Those are luxuries he abandoned long ago, along with the hope of a tomorrow. The townsfolk, though few, still nod silently when they pass in a rickety wagon or stand by broken fence rails. No one asks why he returns day after day, why he sleeps in the same spot, or why he styles himself more like a drifting shadow than a man. They simply let him be, understanding on some unspoken level that some people carry memories too heavy for words, memories that anchor them to a place like stones sunk into mud. In the late afternoon, hooded crow's wheel overhead as he rises with deliberate slowness, picks up his rifle, and walks in the direction the sun will soon follow, but always leads himself back to that tree before dusk settles. Evenings find him seated beneath its shade, eyes closed, face tilted toward the cooling breeze, as if listening for a voice he once vowed not to forget. Sometimes the wind shifts to mimic a whisper. Sometimes it only rustles the skeleton of leaves above his head, but he tenses, as though expecting the sound of returning footsteps or a child's laughter pulled from a dream. In the deepest hush between dusk and dark, he opens his tired eyes and peers at the horizon, where stars begin to glimmer, and time itself seems to stretch. It is there, in that silent moment, that the cowhand wonders if he sleeps here to remember, or to forget, if the barren soil beneath his back is his resting place or his penance. And you, listening to this quiet vigil under that lone cottonwood, in your own stillness, perhaps hear your own heart echo his. Let me know where you are and what time it is where you listen to this. Share with a comment, like a faint footprint left in the dust. Tap the like if this solitude speaks to you, and subscribe so we can meet beneath the same silent branch each night. Because some stories cannot be rushed, they unfold in the spaces between breaths, in the drifting of leaves, in the patient keeping of a cowboy's watch beneath the shade he never leaves. The tree did not change, not in shape, not in shade, not in the way its roots gripped the earth or how its branches reached skyward, like old hands waiting for something that would never return. And neither did the wind, which always came from the same direction each day, stirring the dry grass into a gentle sway, as if nature itself obeyed a rhythm older than memory, a rhythm the cowboy had long ago tuned his body to, so that each time he closed his eyes beneath that stubborn tree, his breath slowed, his limbs softened, and he slipped into sleep, not like a man escaping reality, but like one stepping reverently into a sacred space, a place of stillness where silence was not absence, but presence the only true companion he had left. No dreams of vengeance or fire, no gunshots or galloping hooves broke the veil of that quiet, only a repeated image. The same wind, the same branches, and a single boy running through a field he couldn't name, barefoot, laughing soundlessly, and always disappearing behind the trunk of a tree that looked hauntingly familiar, as though it too had never moved in all these years. The cowboy never woke startled, never cried out, never reached toward the vanishing figure. Instead, he accepted it, as one accepts the slow fading of old ink or the erosion of names on a gravestone. Every night the same shadow stretched long and thin, and every night it folded around him like a blanket stitched from memories he dared not unfold. And though the world turned, and seasons threatened to arrive, and dust layered everything that did not move, still he remained there, unchanged not by stubbornness, but by a quiet devotion to something forgotten, something buried not in the ground but in the seams of his breath. And those who passed by, if they passed at all, said he looked less like a man than a remnant of the land, a ghost resting instead of roaming, as though he'd already reached the destination everyone else was still searching for. Perhaps this was prayer, not with words or hymns, but with stillness, with repetition, with the ache of waiting for a sign that never comes, and sleeping anyway. And as you listen now, wherever you are, tell me, does your night carry a wind like his? Does your silence speak in riddles too? If so, leave a trace here, like a comment sharing the hour and place you drift with us. And subscribe if you wish to return to this shadow night after night, where stories don't shout, but whisper, and where the cowboy never stirs unless the wind remembers the shape of his dream. One morning, when the wind was quiet enough to hear dust moving across stone, 7 children appeared on the ridge, not all at once, but as if stitched into the horizon by the same fading thread of time. Their approach was slow, not cautious, not hurried, but purposeful in that strange way only children understand, the kind of purpose that needs no explanation, the kind that follows memory more than maps. The sun was low and the light was soft, painting long shadows that stretched ahead of them, leading the way like silent guides. And though their clothes were torn, and their feet were bare or bound in boots worn past recognition, none of them seemed troubled by the distance they had come or by the path that still remained. They said nothing, not to each other, not to the wind, not even to the old man beneath the tree, and yet their silence was not emptiness, but a kind of speech older than language, a stillness that made the tree itself seem to lean slightly forward, as if listening. The cowboy, who had not stirred in days, opened his eyes at the moment the children stepped into the shadow of the tree, not startled, not curious, but aware like a clock remembering time, like an old road remembering footsteps. And in that moment, something passed between him and the children, something weightless but undeniable. The smallest child, no taller than the saddle that once hung from the tree, looked up not with fear or hope, but recognition, the kind that comes from deep within. The bones, the kind that whispers, "I've been here before," even when the mind cannot recall the map. They sat without a word, circling the base of the tree in patterns that echoed old campfires or forgotten rituals, and each held in their hands a small wooden object, rough, worn smooth by time, carved with care, but dulled by years of being held, and never named. The cowboy's gaze lingered on those toys, and something inside him stirred, not memory, not quite, but the ache of something nearly remembered. He did not speak, nor did they, but the air between them thickened with shared quiet, the kind that binds strangers without explanation. And the tree, once just a tree, now seemed like a doorway, or a witness, or maybe even a place where time folds in on itself and lets the past sit quietly beside the present. If you're hearing this now, if your night has brought you to this dusty ridge too, tell us what time is it where you are, and did you come barefoot or in worn boots? Leave your answer in the stillness below, one like, one whisper, one echo, and if you wish to meet us again beneath this tree, subscribe and follow the footprints that don't always lead forward, but always lead deeper. They sat without a word, those 7 children, beneath the old twisted tree whose roots clung to the earth like fingers refusing to let go. And as the morning unrolled itself in silence across the dry hills, their bodies settled into the dust. Without resistance, as though they belonged there, as though they had always belonged there. Each of them held a small wooden figure, shaped by hand, not identical, yet unmistakably born from the same maker's touch, rough edges smoothed by time, corners rounded by long-forgotten palms, the kind of toy that remembers more than it reveals. They didn't play, not in the way children are expected to play, but held the objects as one holds a memory, gently, reverently, protectively, and the wind passed around them, careful not to disturb the moment, as if even the breeze understood that something delicate was unfolding beneath the limbs of that ancient tree. The cowboy, who had not opened his eyes in days, did so now, not quickly, not startled, but with the heavy slowness of someone waking into something sacred, and when he saw the toys, his breath caught in a place inside him that hadn't moved in years. His eyes, clouded with the long dust of age, focused not on the children, but on their hands, and then, more precisely, on the wood they held, and slowly, as if reaching through water, memory pushed forward, not in images, not in names, but in shape and texture, the curl of grain, the tilt of a carved hat, the notches made by a blade held with unsure fingers. He had made those toys years ago, in a time before silence, in a life where his hands were not weapons of stillness, but tools of care, and yet here they were, returned to him not by chance, but by children who carried no names and asked no questions, who gave no thanks and expected no stories. There was something holy in the way they sat, something ancient in the way they waited, as if they were not children at all, but echoes sent by time to remind the old man of the hands he once had, and the joy he once gave. He didn't speak there. Was no need, because everything that needed to be said had already been carved into the smooth edges of those toys, into the curves worn down by years of being held through laughter and through sleep. And as the cowboy stared at the toys, the wind whispered through the branches above, and the tree gave a long creak like a sigh, or a story long forgotten returning home, and the old man, for the first time in years, felt something behind his ribs loosen, a knot unraveling, a breath returning home. If this silence speaks to you, if you too have held something that once held you, leave a whisper in the comments, a sign that the past still lives, even if only in the curve of old wood. And if you'd like to rest beneath this tree again, gently subscribe, and let your dreams follow the grain of forgotten hands. They sat without a word, those 7 children, beneath the old twisted tree whose roots clung to the earth like fingers refusing to let go. And as the morning unrolled itself in silence across the dry hills, their bodies settled into the dust. Without resistance, as though they belonged there, as though they had always belonged there. Each of them held a small wooden figure, shaped by hand, not identical, yet unmistakably born from the same maker's touch, rough edges smoothed by time, corners rounded by long-forgotten palms, the kind of toy that remembers more than it reveals. They didn't play, not in the way children are expected to play, but held the objects as one holds a memory, gently, reverently, protectively, and the wind passed around them, careful not to disturb the moment, as if even the breeze understood that something delicate was unfolding beneath the limbs of that ancient tree. The cowboy, who had not opened his eyes in days, did so now, not quickly, not startled, but with the heavy slowness of someone waking into something sacred, and when he saw the toys, his breath caught in a place inside him that hadn't moved in years. His eyes, clouded with the long dust of age, focused not on the children but on their hands, and then, more precisely, on the wood they held, and slowly, as if reaching through water, memory pushed forward not in images, not in names, but in shape and texture, the curl of grain, the tilt of a carved hat, the notches made by a blade held with unsure fingers. He had made those toys years ago, in a time before silence, in a life where his hands were not weapons of stillness, but tools of care, and yet here they were, returned to him not by chance, but by children who carried no names and asked no questions, who gave no thanks and expected no stories. There was something holy in the way they sat, something ancient in the way they waited, as if they were not children at all, but echoes sent by time to remind the old man of the hands he once had, and the joy he once gave. He didn't speak there. Was no need because everything that needed to be said had already been carved into the smooth edges of those toys, into the curves worn down by years of being held through laughter and through sleep. And as the cowboy stared at the toys, the wind whispered through the branches above, and the tree gave a long creak like a sigh, or a story long forgotten returning home, and the old man, for the first time in years, felt something behind his. Ribs, loosen, a knot unraveling, a breath returning home. If this silence speaks to you, if you too have held something that once held you, leave a whisper in the comments, a sign that the past still lives, even if only in the curve of old wood. And if you'd like to rest beneath this tree again, gently subscribe, and let your dreams follow the grain of forgotten hands. The sun was beginning to fall behind the hills, casting long shadows that stretched like memories across the brittle grass, and the cowboy, still seated beneath the old tree, finally leaned forward, his stiff joints creaking in protest, his fingers rough like the bark behind him, and his gaze settled not on the faces of the children, but on what they held in their hands, 7 wooden toys, nearly identical in shape and wear, though each bore a unique scar or scratch, a small burn mark, a notch on an ear, a faded swirl of paint, little imperfections that whispered stories of time, touch, and perhaps love. And as his weathered eyes traced those details, one toy in particular drew his attention, a small wooden horse with a carved mane and a tiny letter on its flank, worn so faint it could be mistaken for a crack, but he knew better because his hands had made that letter in another time, under the low roof of a one-room cabin with a dirt floor and a fire that crackled like laughter in winter. And for a moment he was no longer under the tree, but back in that cabin, carving late into the night with a dull blade, the wood soft from the damp, his young son asleep on a straw mattress nearby, the sound of his breathing slow and sure. And with each toy he carved, he had left a mark, not out of pride but out of hope, that someday someone would know where it came from, and perhaps, just perhaps, remember him kindly. And now, decades later, the toy had returned not through the mail, not through trade, but through the silent hands of a child whose eyes shone like stars seen from the open plains, and the cowboy's heart clenched not with pain but with awe, because somehow the toy had survived, had been carried across time and hands and homes, and it had come back to him not for reclaiming but for recognition, and he wanted to speak, to ask, to name, but the silence between them was sacred now, and instead he gently reached forward, palm open beneath the toy but never touching it, as if to say, I remember, I see you, and I know what you carry. And the child holding it gave a slight nod, not of understanding perhaps, but of acceptance, and it was enough. Because some things are not taught or told, they are felt, passed from one soul to another without needing words, and the cowboy leaned back again, breathing deeper now, as if that small horse had lifted something from his chest, something heavy and hidden, and all around them, the world grew quieter, not just from the fading of wind, but from the stillness of something completed. And the other children, too, held their toys with a kind of reverence, their eyes soft, their mouths closed, as if they too were remembering something they had never lived but always known. And under the branches of that old tree, in the waning Light of day, the cowboy realized that these his toys were not made just of wood and memory, but of connection, a fragile thread running between lives that had drifted apart and now, briefly, had woven back together. And though he did not cry, his throat ached with the fullness of what could not be said. And for the first time in years, he felt the weight of his name, not as a burden, but as something once shared and maybe, in the silence, shared again. The cowboy sat a little straighter now, as if something inside him had shifted, and his eyes, usually anchored to the dust and roots of the present, turned instead toward the horizon of memory, where the sun always hung lower, golden, and slow. And as the children sat quietly in the tree's shadow, he felt his breath begin to match the rhythm of old footsteps, footsteps that once led away from a place he never truly left, a place where he had built things with his hands before they trembled, a cabin tucked near a stream where the wind always carried the smell of pine and the laughter of a boy who had never learned to frown. And though the years had buried that place beneath regret and time, it now stirred within him, not as a pain but as a presence. And he remembered the small workshop, the crooked work table, the feel of worn tools against smoother wood, and most of all, the way his son's voice had filled the walls, not with words always, but with hums, stories, dreams half-spoken, and sometimes just laughter that needed no reason. And there, in that forgotten house, he had made toys not to sell but to keep, to give, to remember with. And when he had left, when life and choices in silence had pulled him down a road with no return, he had sworn to forget that place, to bury it so deep that even dreams would not find it. And yet here he was, under a different tree, years later, with a child holding one of those very toys, and all that forgetting unraveled at once, thread by thread, replaced by images too strong to resist: the cracked door, the smoke from the chimney, the creak of the rocking chair, the echo of a lullaby his wife used to hum before the world grew too heavy. And in that flood of memory, he saw the day he walked away, the boy asleep, the house warm, the heart cold. And though he had never returned, the road had never really let him go. And now, surrounded by children who did not speak but somehow seemed to understand, he realized that some paths never end. They only circle, they wait, they watch, and maybe, just maybe, they open again when we're ready to walk them barefoot, broken, but finally awake. And the cowboy looked to the horizon, not in longing, but in listening. For in the silence he could almost hear the creak of that old gate again, and it did not call him back, but it forgave him for leaving. And that forgiveness sat in his chest like a soft ember, not enough to burn, but enough to warm. And he knew then, there were roads we do not return from because we were never meant to. They return to us when our shadows are long enough to reach back. When the sun rose, it did so slowly as if unsure whether to reveal what the night had concealed, and the cowboy stirred beneath the familiar shade of the tree, the one that had for so many years offered him quiet more than comfort, shadow more than shelter. And as he opened his eyes, crusted with sleep and time, he sensed it before he saw it, a stillness too absolute, a hush too hollow, and the air, usually warm with breath and breathlessness, now hung with absence. And the tree no longer felt like a place of waiting, but of departure. And the children, those silent wanderers who had appeared without word or warning, were gone, vanished as mysteriously as they had come. And though the earth bore no prints and the wind carried no scent, he knew they had been real, not dream, not ghost, for their presence had stirred something ancient in him, a softness he had forgotten how to wear. And he sat up slowly, brushing dust from his coat as if brushing away memory. But it clung, it always clung. And as he looked around, he found nothing. No toys, no voices, no eyes watching from the edge of morning. But then he turned, and there, on the thick bark of the tree, 7 small notches had been carved, delicate yet deliberate. A child's hand maybe, or several. And each mark was uneven, imperfect, yet unmistakably counted. 1, 2, 3, 7. And he reached out, rough fingers tracing each one, as if they were names in a language long forgotten. and he felt his throat tighten, because those notches were not just farewell, they were memory engraved, left behind like breadcrumbs. For a man who had long since stopped following trails, and in that moment, the cowboy did not speak, did not cry, but simply leaned his head against the tree, as though it alone could carry the weight of all he had just lost again. And the wind, catching in the branches, whistled something that sounded like a lullaby with no words, and in that melody, he found a quiet confirmation. They had come not for conversation, but for connection, not to be heard, but to be held, however briefly, and they had left him a sign, not of absence, but of acknowledgement, a message carved in silence, saying, "We were here, and so were you." And it was enough not to fill, but to seal something cracked. And he stayed there long after the sun climbed, the day warmed, and the world moved on without noticing that one man under one tree had changed forever, for he knew now that not all departures are endings. Some are beginnings folded inside goodbyes, and not all visits need return. Some simply need to be felt, remembered, and released. When the cowboy opened his eyes that morning, the world was soaked in a soft amber light, the kind that makes even silence seem sacred. And for a moment, he didn't move, half expecting, half hoping to see small feet dancing in the dust, shadows of children shifting under the leaves, but all was still, the ground undisturbed, the wind slow and steady, and the air filled only with the sound of breath that belonged solely to him. He sat up carefully, joints creaking like old barn doors, and there, resting gently on his knees as if it had been placed by invisible hands while he slept, was a wooden toy familiar in its design, worn along the edges where fingers had once gripped it tightly, its surface dulled by time but not forgotten by touch, and the sight of it made something within him fold, like parchment heated by flame, and he picked it up with trembling hands, eyes narrowing against the morning light as he turned it over slowly, reverently, and on its underside, barely visible beneath the dust and grain, was a name scratched in a child's clumsy script, uneven but unmistakable, and it was a name he had not spoken in decades. Perhaps a name he had once vowed to forget, or simply tried to survive without. Jesse, and when he saw it, the name struck like a bell long buried, echoing through years of hardened silence, and his breath caught in his throat not from surprise, but from recognition, like remembering the melody of a lullaby without the words, or the way a child laughs just before sleep. And he whispered the name, once, then again, and each time it felt less like an echo and more like a return. And suddenly, the toy was no longer a thing, it was a doorway, a key, a bridge to some part of himself he had sealed away in grief, too broken to bury, too fragile to carry. And the cowboy closed his eyes, held the toy to his chest, and listened not for sounds in the air, but for memories rising like soft smoke through his bones, and in them he saw a porch at sunset, tiny boots by the door, a giggle behind haystacks, small hands handing him wood and nails asking, "Can we make one more?" And he, younger then, lighter in soul, smiling through tired eyes as they carved side by side in silence. No need for words between them, just the joy of building something together, something simple, something lasting. And now, decades later, it had returned, not as a gift, but as a message, that love once made does not vanish, even if names fade, even if faces blur. It waits, patiently, in quiet corners of the world, in tree shadows and toy grain, waiting to be remembered, not to change the past, but to gently remind the soul that forgetting is never the same as letting go. And the cowboy, hand clenched softly around the small wooden figure, felt something settle inside him, not closure, not peace, but a kind of tenderness that no longer needed to be hidden, a softness that belonged to a man who had once made toys for a boy named Jesse, and maybe, just maybe, had not failed him as deeply as he thought. And as the wind passed gently through the leaves above, the toy in his hand seemed to weigh less than it had moments before, or perhaps it was the sorrow lifting, now that it had been named. That morning, when the sun rose with its usual hush and the branches above still reached across the ground like open hands offering shelter, the cowboy stood slowly with the kind of care reserved for things long still and long sacred, and for the first time in years, maybe decades, he didn't stretch or sigh or tip his hat back to block the light, but simply looked up, really looked, at the sky that had been his only roof, and the tree that had been his only companion. And where once there was hesitation, now there was only stillness. Not the stillness of fear or of loss, but of quiet understanding. The kind that settles like dust and carries no weight. He took one last look at the patch of earth where his body had shaped itself night after night, at the soft curve in the roots where his back had leaned, at the marks etched in the bark, not by knife but by presence. And then his gaze drifted down 7 small notches, side by side, carved so shallowly they could have been mistaken for accidents. But he knew better. He knew they were left by hands that did not speak, by children who said nothing yet remembered everything. And in that moment, he felt no ache, no longing, only something close to gratitude. Because sometimes, those we've lost don't return to stay, they return to remind us we were never alone to begin with. And so he bent down one last time, fingertips brushing the dirt, not to gather anything but to leave something, a worn handkerchief folded twice, the color of faded denim, tied with a thread and nothing inside but a pebble, the kind children collect without reason, the kind that means something only to those who once held it tight in a tiny fist. And with that, he turned away, not heavily, but as if pulled by something distant and familiar, like a sound you remember from childhood but cannot name. His boots, once sunk into place like tree roots, now lifted cleanly, carrying him away from the shadow he had shared with ghosts, with silence, and with wooden toys. And as he walked, the wind behind him picked up just slightly, not enough to rustle the branches, but enough to lift a single dry leaf from the ground and send it tumbling after him, like a last goodbye from a tree that had held its breath for so long. And far in the distance, though no one saw, and no one would mark the moment in story or in stone, a man who once thought he'd grown old beneath an unchanging sky took a step not into the future, nor into the past, but simply into what was next.